Welcome to the final session of our series, The Questionable Life. We want to acknowledge that we are all in different places in our spiritual journey. Some of us are followers of Jesus, and others are still investigating. But if there's one thing we all have in common, we want our lives to matter, and we all want our lives to make a difference. Deep down, every person wants to live a life that's different from the norm. It's the kind of life that people notice. It makes them reflect on why you do what you do, because it's not really what's expected, easy or typical. Chances are you probably know somebody like this, the person who goes out of their way to do good for others, the person who lives a simple life and is incredibly generous towards others, or the person who forgives endlessly and inspires others to do the same. These people make you think. They don't live by cultural norms. They live lives that make you question why they do what they do. Jesus was a lot like that. His life and behavior would definitely be considered countercultural. In fact, it often put him at odds with those who were considered the religious leaders of his day. In Jesus' day, the Jewish cultural expectation was that you strive to be as religious as possible. Doing this gave you some reputation and influence. You were perceived as being really good at following the Old Testament law. There was a group of Jewish leaders called the Pharisees who were perceived to be the best of the best at keeping all the laws, so they took great effort to ensure that everyone else knew how good they were at following the letter of the law. Now, to be clear, there was nothing wrong with following the Old Testament law. God expected it from the Jews. The conflicts that developed between Jesus and the Pharisees came when the Pharisees used the law and even twisted it to make some kind of measuring stick of who was acceptable before God and who was not. One thing that infuriated Jesus were fakes and frauds, people who claimed to be followers of God, but were really only interested in keeping step with religious culture and protecting their own reputation. However, you will never find Jesus taking someone to task for their wrongdoings when they come to him with a humble heart, seeking forgiveness and a chance to start over. What we hope you take away from this message is that you can't fake your way into a questionable life. What matters is your heart. Jesus says what comes out of the mouth starts in the heart. He mentions all sorts of bad stuff. Arguments, adultery, theft, lies, stuff we see on the outside but actually starts on the inside, the heart. What Jesus offers to people is a cure for deep-level brokenness. This cure cuts across what the other teachers of his day were offering. The religious leaders saw following the Jewish law as the place to start and were often content to stop there. But Jesus wants us to be transformed from the inside out. How does that happen? It starts with your heart. We hope that you'll take some time during your small group during this session to explore what we call the cycle of grace. The cycle of grace starts with recognizing that we are all accepted by God. The next step in the cycle is having practices in our lives that will sustain God's grace and nourish our souls. The third step in the cycle of grace is called significance. The idea behind significance is that we recognize that we were created to make a difference beyond ourselves. And as God's grace flows into us and we have practices that sustain that grace, this is the point where we begin to allow that grace to flow out from us into the lives of others. As we do, we recognize that our lives have great significance. Jesus knew his identity was rooted in God's love, and because of that, his life had significance. The last step in the cycle of grace is achievement. This is action. This is when your life produces things. Jesus lived from the inside out. All of his actions flowed in the direction of grace. When we get into trouble is when we try to reverse this cycle and go backwards. But when we live authentic lives from the inside out, we get to enjoy God's grace. And when we do, God will give us plenty of opportunities to share about what God is doing in our lives. As you have your small group discussion, take a moment to notice that there are some additional scriptures for you to reflect on in our Next Steps guide, which is part of the discussion guide. We hope you have a great small group.